The candle is flickering low, casting long shadows as the spirit of heaviness descends upon Hampton Court. It is approaching the midnight hour, and 19-year-old Catherine Howard sits isolated in a chamber that has transformed from a palace of luxury into a spiritual prison. Just a few hours ago, she was walking in the pride of life, wearing the crown of England as the fifth wife to King Henry VIII. She sat in the high places, but as we know, pride comes before a fall. The court and its flatterers called her his Rose Without a Thorn, a deceptive title that masked the reality. But now the guards have locked down her door. Her ladies cannot even meet her eyes, sensing the judgment that is about to manifest. And somewhere through the spiritual corridors of these ancient walls, she hears a sound that freezes her blood cold. The King of England is weeping. When a king weeps, the covenant is broken and wrath is at the door. Then come the footsteps. This isn't the gentle shuffle of servants coming to serve, and it's not the familiar rhythm of her attendants. This is the march of destiny. These footsteps are slow, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of governmental authority. They stop right outside her door. The knock that follows is not a request for entry, it is a summons to judgment. Catherine rises to her feet. She does not tremble, perhaps because the shock has steeled her spirit. The door swings open and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer stands in the threshold like an agent of the Inquisition. His face wears the mask of compassion, a classic tactic of the system, but his eyes betray nothing warm. Behind him stands a wall of armed men, far too many for a simple conversation. This is a raid on her soul. When he speaks, his voice is measured and respectful, using the smooth words of diplomacy. But make no mistake, his words land like a sharp blade. He has come to interrogate her about her past, about the years before she ascended to the throne, and about her actions after she took the crown. The books are being opened. In that instant, Catherine Howard receives a revelation. She understands everything. Someone has talked. The betrayer has been at work. The secrets she buried deep in the earth have clawed their way back to the surface. As the scripture warns, be sure your sin will find you out. What follows next is not just the story of a physical execution, it is a prophetic warning about the cost of hidden things. It is the story of 90 days of absolute psychological destruction that some historians believe were crueler than the blade itself. It was the dismantling of a mind. You will witness how a childhood spent in the chaotic, unsupervised household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk planted the seeds of her downfall. It shows us the danger of a lack of covering. You will see how the names Henry Manox, Francis Derham, and Thomas Culpeper became instruments of her destruction vessels used to seal her fate. You will understand how Tudor justice operated ruthless and unforgiving when a king felt his heart and his pride had been betrayed. And you will watch a teenage girl lose everything piece by piece, stripped of her identity, long before she ever climbed those scaffold steps to meet her end. What happened to Catherine Howard was a manifestation of many things. But let me tell you, true justice was not one of them. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to know where the remnant is watching from across the globe. To truly understand the spiritual weight of what Catherine faced that night with Archbishop Cranmer, you must travel backward in time. We have to go back before the crown, before Hampton Court, before Henry VIII ever laid eyes on her. Catherine Howard entered this world around the year 1523, likely in Lambeth, born into a timeline that would shake the foundations of England. Nobody even bothered to mark the date on the calendar. She wasn't born into royalty, she wasn't sitting on a massive inheritance. And quite frankly, she wasn't a girl anyone expected the history books to remember. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, might have carried a noble last name that opened doors, but his pockets were completely empty. A title with absolutely zero financial power behind it. The man spent his entire existence caught in a cycle of debt, constantly borrowing money to pay off yesterday's mistakes, begging for handouts from his wealthy relatives, and completely failing to provide the stability and protection his children desperately needed. Tragedy struck early when Catherine's mother passed away while she was just a little girl. And after that loss, Edmund did exactly what desperate, broken aristocrats always seem to do. He packed his daughter up and shipped her off to get lost in the system, sending her to live with a powerful relative, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Now, from the outside, this London residence looked like a palace impressive, sprawling the picture of elite success. But don't let the exterior fool you, because inside those walls, it was absolute spiritual anarchy. Chaos ruled supreme. You had dozens of children, distant cousins, and random dependents all crammed under one roof like cattle. And as for adult supervision, it was practically non-existent. Sure, when the sun was up, the older women would enforce the laws of etiquette and household management. But the second darkness fell, the rules completely evaporated. Catherine was thrown into shared sleeping quarters with the other girls in a place they ironically called the Maiden's Chamber. In theory, this was supposed to be a sanctuary, a safe space where young noble women were groomed for respectable marriages and taught how to navigate the court with dignity. But in reality, it turned into something else entirely. It became a hunting ground where young men from the household realized they could slip inside once the lights went out. We're talking about servants, clerks, random visitors. They all knew that the Maiden's Chamber was unguarded territory ripe for the taking. Years later, when everything came to light, witnesses would describe these events to investigators without a shred of shame or hesitation, exposing the deep moral rot of the household. But back when it was actually happening, not a single adult stepped up to stand in the gap and protect these girls from the predators circling them. He started with the classic groomer playbook flattery, giving her extra attention during lessons and making a neglected girl feel like she finally mattered to someone. Then his behavior crossed the... You have to ask yourself, did Catherine truly comprehend the dark reality of the situation she was being groomed into? Did she really believe she possessed the authority to say no to the powers preying upon her? Is it even possible for a child placed in such a vulnerable position to ever give true consent? The system doesn't want you to ask that. None of these critical questions about her trauma were ever raised during the official inquisitions. The agents of the state who were dissecting the Queen's history had a singular carnal focus. They weren't looking for the truth of her suffering, they were looking for a political weapon. The fact is, Catherine Howard had been accessed and violated long before she ever crossed paths with the king. Mannix was just the first handler in this tragic story. But the cycle of abuse continued years later when a young man named Francis Derham entered her sphere of influence. He was embedded right there within the Duchess's household, operating under the cover of a secretary. He was young, brazen, and carried that magnetic charm that so often disguises a predatory spirit. But understand this, he and Catherine were slipping into a profound darkness, a soul tie deeper than any surface attraction. Under the veil of the night watch, Derham infiltrated the sanctuary of her room. They lay together in that secret place, becoming one flesh in the shadows, completely unaware that their hidden actions were sowing seeds of destruction for the future. Look at the spiritual covenant they made. They didn't just swap trinkets and whisper in the dark. They exchanged secret names and spoke the words husband and wife over each other. To them, this wasn't child's play. It was a soul tie, a binding agreement that carried real weight in the spirit realm. You have to understand the legalistic system of that era. Under the English laws back then, if a man and a woman made those kinds of promises with genuine intent, it was a done deal. It constituted a binding pre-contract of marriage, sealed as effectively as if they had signed it in blood before a judge. If such a contract was found to exist, the system viewed it as absolute. Any marriage that took place afterward was considered null and void, built on a foundation of illegitimacy. And family, this specific detail would become a loaded weapon in the hands of her enemies. Once Catherine put on that crown and stepped into the high seat of power, she had to lie. She would have to deny that any binding agreement ever existed to protect her position. But the past has a way of resurfacing. Francis Derham was ready to swear under oath that the bond was real, standing as a witness against her denial. What started as a teenage romance conducted in the shadows without the covering of righteous leadership transformed into a legal tripwire. It was a dormant trap, just waiting for the right moment to be sprung on her destiny. By the time Catherine arrived at the royal court in her mid-teens, we are talking about a girl of maybe 16 or 17 years old. She was already carrying a heavy burden. She had a history that could destroy her. The servants in the Norfolk household had seen everything. They were witnesses to the corruption. They had heard the whispers, the dirty jokes, and the lovers' quarrels echoing through the halls. Some of them had walked right in on moments that left absolutely nothing to the imagination, seeing the sin with their own eyes. What was once just idle household gossip had effectively turned into a weaponized dossier. It was a file of evidence stacked up and waiting to be unsealed to bring her down. When Catherine left to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, she thought she was moving up, but her history was right there with her. You cannot outrun your past. The truth clung to the memories of everyone who had watched her in those shadows. And once she got to court, the timeline accelerated. Events started spiraling beyond anyone's control, moving at the speed of judgment. Look at the context. King Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves was crumbling to dust. The king himself was falling apart, aging heavy and suffering constant agonizing pain from an infected, rotting wound on his leg. Yet despite his decay, he remained the most powerful figure in the land. He held the scepter of the English system, the absolute authority. When his eyes locked onto the vivacious young Catherine, among his new queen's attendants, a spirit of obsession took hold. He didn't just see a girl, he saw a prize. It was a convergence of agendas: Henry's insatiable hunger, the ruthless ambition of Catherine's Howard relatives, and the cold political calculations of the mighty Norfolk family. All of it pushed toward one inevitable outcome. The system moved fast. The king's marriage to Anne was annulled, wiped away. Catherine was transformed overnight from a serving girl in the background to the royal bride, the centerpiece of the empire. For a brief, dazzling moment in time, Catherine must have felt like she had conquered the world. She had risen from being an overlooked child in a crowded, chaotic household to becoming the Queen of England. Henry showered her with the spoils of the kingdom, jewels, gowns, and extravagant gifts. He called her his rose without a thorn, completely blind to the reality of the situation. The foreign ambassadors were lining up to praise her beauty and charm. The entire court was fixated on her, watching her every gesture like hawks. But if you scratched beneath that glittering surface, the reality was brutal. Catherine was just a teenager bound to a man who was old enough to be her father. She was shackled to a king with a rotting body and an ego as fragile as glass. He demanded absolute perfection, complete purity before the marriage, total loyalty afterward, and total control over her existence at all times. It was a spirit of domination. And right inside the palace walls, another man entered the narrative. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. He was young, well-born, and granted personal access to Henry himself, a dangerous proximity to power. He moved through the royal apartments with an unusual freedom, walking through doors that were shut to others. Catherine wasn't a stranger to him. She had known him before her marriage, or at least known of him. He had shown her kindness back when kindness was a rare commodity in her life. After she ascended to the throne, they encountered each other constantly in the royal circles. That old fondness turned into warmth. And let me tell you that warmth quickly turned into dangerous fire. The secret meetings began, always hidden from the public eye. They used an intermediary to facilitate the connection: Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother. Lady Rochford arranged the nighttime encounters. She stood watch guarding the doors like a sentinel while the Queen and Culpeper spoke in private, cloaked in shadows. Now, whether those conversations ever crossed the line into physical betrayal is something historians still debate to this day. But the bottom line is that the meetings were hidden. They were repeated, and they were incredibly reckless. In the cutthroat world of Tudor England, a queen could not afford even the shadow of such intimacy. Let's take you back to that cold November night at Hampton Court. Catherine is sitting in her guarded chamber, the walls closing in on her. Archbishop Cranmer walks in, and his face is unreadable like stone. He represents the judgment of the system. He begins with courteous words, but his questions are precision strikes targeting her years in the Dowager Duchess's household. He starts naming names: Henry Manox, Francis Derham. He brings up the witnesses who described intimate contact. Then he pivots to the present day, her time as queen. He drops the name Thomas Culpeper. He lists the nighttime meetings. He mentions Lady Rochford acting as the sentinel. He asks the damning question: why does innocent conversation require a lookout at the door? Catherine cannot see the documents he is holding, but she knows exactly what they contain. Her spirit feels the weight of the evidence. They have the statements, the confessions, the testimony from people she once trusted, people who are now in custody being pressed by the authorities for every single detail. Cranmer lays it out clearly. The king demands a complete accounting of her behavior. He wants the full story from before the marriage and after. She can write it herself or speak it aloud, but she must not hold back a single thing. The warning is unmistakable and severe. If her story contradicts the evidence they already possess in their files, they will assume she is lying. And in matters touching the king's honor, lying isn't just a sin, it is a crime. It is treason. That night, Cranmer does not leave. He sits at a distance watching her like a hawk as she begins to write. Catherine faces the ultimate dilemma. She must decide what to confess and what to conceal, all without knowing exactly what others have already revealed to the inquisitors. She admits that Henry Manox touched her inappropriately, opening the door to the sins of her youth. She insists they never went further than that. She admits her relationship with Francis Dereham, including the fact that he came to her bed in the dead of night. But she stands firm on one point. She vehemently denies any promise of marriage. She denies the covenant. She tries to spin the narrative, presenting herself not as a woman of free will making calculated decisions, but as a foolish, unsupervised child who merely stumbled into the trap of sin. However, when it comes to Thomas Culpeper, she draws a definitive line in the sand, knowing that admission leads straight to the pit. She has to admit there were meetings because the eyes of the watchmen were everywhere. Too many witnesses had already seen the truth. Yet even under pressure, she maintains the lie that they never physically committed adultery, trying to hold on to a form of godliness while denying the power thereof. She describes the exchange of tokens and emotional conversations, trying to characterize it as innocent affection rather than a betrayal of her covenant. This defense is not born of mere pride family. It is a desperate attempt to redefine the nature of her transgression before the judgment seat. The legal and spiritual consequences facing her are absolutely staggering to comprehend. The exposure of her premarital misconduct with Manox and Dereham has the power to utterly humiliate her and crack the foundation of her position, showing us that what is done in the dark will surely come to light. But let's be clear about the law of the land. Adultery, after entering into a covenant marriage with the king, is defined as treason. And just as the wages of sin is death, the penalty for treason in this kingdom is the termination of life itself. Her strategy is simple but dangerous. If she can persuade the investigators that her dealings with Culpeper were merely the foolishness of youth and not a criminal conspiracy, she thinks she might escape the wrath to come and survive another day. While Catherine sits trapped within those four walls, weighing every single word like gold in a furnace, the relentless machinery of Tudor justice is already grinding its gears, preparing to crush her beneath the weight of the state. You have to understand this system bore absolutely no resemblance to the modern trials we see today with defense attorneys and established rights. This was a raw exercise of power similar to the tribunals we see forming in the spirit in 2026. Once the Crown decided to target a soul, the mission was never about finding the truth. It was about extraction and interpreting every single fact in the most damaging light possible to satisfy the king's demand for judgment. The officials moved like demonic entities, interrogating servants, relatives, and acquaintances, repeatedly breaking down every wall of silence to get to the rot underneath. Anyone who refused to cooperate or bow to the system risked being charged with concealing treason themselves. Under that immense pressure, just like in the end times, the love of many grew cold, and most people talked to save their own skin. Many of them said far more than they actually knew, speculating wildly about motives and inventing salacious details just to fill in the gaps, fueled by a spirit of accusation and fear. Even the high and mighty were not spared. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk was grilled about what kind of iniquity occurred under her own roof. Her servants were pulled into the interrogation room, stripping away every layer of privacy. Every young person who had ever shared the Maiden's Chamber with Catherine was hunted down with relentless precision. The dragnet went out, and Henry Manox was arrested and thrown into chains. The judgment continued to roll out. Francis Dereham was arrested. Thomas Culpeper was arrested. Even Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, found herself in shackles. The awakening of justice was sweeping through the entire household. All of them faced the same impossible biblical choice: cooperate with the beast system or face the full unbridled fury of the law that knows no mercy. Manox, trying to save himself, confirmed everything Catherine had admitted about his behavior and then piled on more. He described the sexual touching in explicit graphic detail, boasting about his conquest and how far the corruption had spread. His words did more than just stain her past. They painted a portrait of a girl who was accustomed to the ways of the world and sexual behavior long before she ever met the king, destroying her image of purity. But it was Dereham's testimony that proved to be the hammer blow, vastly more devastating than the first. Under intense questioning and almost certainly under the physical and psychological coercion that defines tyrannical regimes, he described their complete sexual relationship, leaving nothing hidden. He repeated the damning fact that they had called each other husband and wife in the sight of God. Then he added a new lethal detail that would seal her fate forever. He revealed that when Catherine became queen, she had given him a position right there in her household. To the investigators looking for a conspiracy, this looked like undeniable proof of corruption. They asked the obvious question: why would a queen risk placing a former lover in her inner circle unless she intended to resume the affair and bring that old spirit back into the palace? From their perspective, this was not the naivety of a child or fear that Dirham might expose her secrets. It was clear evidence of deliberate intent to deceive the king and defile the throne. Then came Thomas Culpeper, questioned in total isolation with absolutely no knowledge of the narrative Catherine had written to protect herself. He did not protect her account or cover her sins. He admitted to the secret meetings. He admitted to the powerful mutual attraction that pulled them together like magnets. Most critically, he confessed that he meant to do ill with the queen and believed in his heart that she felt the exact same way. This was the confession of the heart's intent. Even without an explicit admission of physical adultery, those words were fatal because in the eyes of the law, the thought and the intent are as good as the deed itself. Under the strict Tudor law, when the queen was involved, the mere intent to commit adultery could be prosecuted as high treason. The law judges the heart just as harshly as the hand. Catherine's written statement and Culpeper's confession were in total contradiction. She denied any treasonous intent existed in her spirit, but he had already told the council that the desire was fully there. In a system that always favored the harshest interpretation when the king felt wounded and betrayed, this gap in the story was absolutely catastrophic for her defense. Tragically, she did not yet know any of this was happening outside her door. She was still in the dark about the storm that had already gathered. She knew only that more officials came and went, that her guards grew stricter by the hour, and that messages passed her door without being shared. The days stretched into weeks of agonizing silence. Every time footsteps echoed in the cold corridor, she had to wonder in her heart, were they coming to say the king had extended grace and forgiven her sins? Or were they coming to say that he had decided she must die for her transgressions? On November 22nd, 1541, the waiting finally came to an end. A formal delegation of lords and councillors arrived at her chambers in Hampton Court. Their expressions were set like stone, devoid of empathy. They carried the final decision from the King's Council. Catherine Howard was about to learn the hard lesson that the crown on her head had already been taken away by the powers that be. When that delegation entered Catherine's chambers on November 22nd, 1541, their bows were noticeably shallower than before, signaling the shift in the spiritual atmosphere. They addressed her simply as Your Grace instead of Your Majesty. In the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England, that single change in title said everything you needed to know about her fall. These men were the high priests of the King's Council. They had not come to negotiate terms of surrender. They had come to deliver a verdict that had already been reached in the secret chambers. They told her directly without sugarcoating the judgment. She was no longer queen. By the king's sovereign command acting through the council, her royal title was stripped and revoked. She would not sit beside him on the throne again. Her name would be blotted out and removed from the prayers, for the sovereigns effectively erasing her from the spiritual covering of the realm. The honors and glory she had worn for barely 16 months were erased in a single formal sentence, proving how fleeting the treasures of this world truly are. On the parchment of history, she was once again simply Catherine Howard. In truth, she was now more exposed and vulnerable than she had ever been as an overlooked girl back in the Dowager Duchess's household. You must understand, losing the title was not merely about wounded pride or ego. It was the stripping of her protection, leaving her open to the judgment that was to come. You have to understand, the moment the accusations hit, it was like a spiritual covering was ripped right off her soul. A reigning queen usually operates behind this invisible shield of immunity, where questioning her is tantamount to questioning the king's own divine discernment. In that system, pointing a finger at the queen was like signing your own death warrant. You risked the total unbridled wrath of the monarch. But the second that crown was lifted from her brow, she was left completely naked and vulnerable to the crushing, catastrophic weight of royal justice. The Privy Council, the deep state of that era, made one thing crystal clear to everyone watching. She was never ever going to set foot in her royal apartments again. That chapter of her life was closed and locked. They were extracting her from the center of power at Hampton Court entirely. Her new assignment, she was being shipped off to Sion Abbey, a place that sounds holy but was about to become her prison. Now pay attention to the history here. Sion Abbey used to be a thriving spiritual house right along the Thames River. But after King Henry dissolved the monasteries and seized the church's assets, it became just another piece of government-controlled real estate. It was a fortress, secure, isolated, and under total state surveillance. That made it the perfect black site for stashing away someone who was still technically important, but had become a massive inconvenience to the agenda. The officials dropped the hammer and told Catherine she would be detained there indefinitely, while the king and his parliament, the legislative beast, decided her ultimate fate. They didn't give her a timeline, folks. They didn't drop a single hint about whether she would live or die. It was total psychological warfare designed to keep her in a state of constant terror. Catherine was broken. She begged and pleaded just to see Henry one last time. She swore she would throw herself at his feet in total submission and confess every single sin and secret. She was ready to accept whatever punishment or judgment he handed down. All she wanted, her one desperate prayer, was to look him in the eye and speak with him face to face, spirit to spirit. But the men standing in front of her, they were stone cold. They made zero promises. Some reports claim they tried to gaslight her, saying the king was too heartbroken and emotionally distressed to handle seeing her. Other sources suggest they just stood there in silence. But either way, the answer was a hard no. The door between Catherine and Henry was sealed shut like the door to the Ark when the rain started falling. Her entire support system was dismantled in the blink of an eye. The vast majority of her servants were fired on the spot, kicked out into the streets without a second thought. Others were rounded up and detained for interrogation. Only a tiny handful of hand-picked women were allowed to go with her to Sion, but make no mistake, their loyalty was to the crown, not to her. Their real mission wasn't just to help her get dressed or eat. They were handlers. Their job was to watch her every move, listen to every word she muttered, and report her emotional state back to headquarters. Catherine had to watch in horror as the faces of people she thought she knew transformed. They went from warm and familiar to cold, formal, and distant, like switches being flipped. Even the ones who felt sorry for her were terrified to show an ounce of compassion. That short trip down the river from Hampton Court to Sion might have been quick in miles, but spiritually it was an infinite journey into darkness. She was surrounded by armed guards the entire time. She had absolutely no voice, no agency, and no say in where they stopped or who was allowed to come near her. When she finally arrived at Sion Abbey, they put her in rooms that looked comfortable on the surface, but don't be fooled, it was a gilded cage designed specifically for high-level confinement. She didn't have the keys to her own life anymore. She couldn't control who came in or out. Every single doorway was governed by soldiers and government officials watching her like hawks. Life at Sion turned into a grim, grey routine of waiting. Catherine was allowed to walk in specific zones, but always under the watchful eye of her captors' constant, unrelenting supervision. Sure, she got food, clothes, and the basic courtesies you give to a VIP prisoner who used to wear a crown. They kept her physically alive, but emotionally, they were starving her out. Every single connection to the outside world was severed and monitored. No letters got in. None of the desperate pleas she tried to smuggle out ever made it past the censors. The only scraps of intel she got came from servants whispering in the shadows when they thought no one was listening, leaking truth in a time of deceit. Or she'd catch a slip of the tongue from an official who said too much. From the minute she landed in that place, Catherine was haunted by one consuming, terrifying question. Was this just a waiting room for mercy, or was it the antechamber of death history showed it could go either way? Look at Anne of Cleves. She got set aside but was treated with a golden parachute. There were others who had disappointed the king and just got exiled, sent away to live in obscurity rather than facing the executioner's blade. But the dark shadow of Anne Boleyn was hanging over everything like a curse. Henry had already sent one wife to the scaffold. The precedent for blood sacrifice was already set. He was fully capable of doing it again. And while Catherine was there trying to decode every small gesture for hope, the events back in London were moving faster than a freight train. On December 1st, 1541, Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were dragged to the Guildhall to stand trial for high treason against the crown. By the time they walked into that courtroom, it was already over. The government had their confessions and the witness statements locked and loaded. It was a done deal before it started. The verdict was never in doubt. Both men were found guilty of plotting treason, all revolving around adultery, or even just the intention of adultery with the king's wife. The sentencing was absolutely savage, following the brutal letter of the law for anyone labelled a traitor to the state. It was designed to send a message. Derham didn't have the social status Culpeper had, so he got the full nightmare treatment, condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered. We are talking about hanging a man until he's almost dead, then cutting him down while he's still gasping for air, disemboweling him, emasculating him, and finally hacking his body into 4 pieces like a butcher. It was ritualistic slaughter. Culpeper, because he was a gentleman of the court, got a slight mercy. His sentence was commuted to a simple beheading, quick and relatively clean compared to the other guy. He would die faster, and his body would be left mostly in one piece. On December 10th, the state carried out these executions at Tyburn for all the world to see. Culpeper went first, dying under the axe. Then Derham had to endure the full horrific traitor's ritual. The purpose of this public brutality was crystal clear to everyone watching. It was about terror, pure and simple. It was a demonstration of the king's absolute godlike power over life and death, meant to shake the population to its core. Afterward, following the dark customs of the time, they took the heads of both men and mounted them on spikes high above London Bridge as a warning. Every single traveller entering or leaving the city had to look up and see those rotting heads staring back at them. It was a visual reminder of who was in charge. Now Catherine didn't see any of this with her own eyes, but the king's government made damn sure she knew that the men at the centre of her drama were dead and gone. Sometime after December 10th, somebody dropped the news on her. Maybe it was a guard following cruel orders, or maybe a servant who thought she deserved to know the grim reality. She found out that Derham and Culpeper had been executed as traitors to the crown. She learned that their severed heads were up there on display for the entire kingdom to mock. It was one thing to be afraid she might have put people in danger. It was a whole different level of trauma to know that the men who had once held her were now destroyed. It wasn't just about speaking with her or exchanging little tokens of affection. Those men died in agony, butchered under the blade because of the deep soul ties and the secrets that had passed between them. You can imagine the heavy demonic cocktail of emotions swirling around her spirit, a suffocating mixture of overwhelming guilt, pure unadulterated horror, and a trembling terror that freezes the blood. The veil was lifted from her eyes and she finally grasped the cold, hard truth that the government of that day would not hesitate to spill blood to cover up this scandal. She realized the sword was hovering right over her own neck, sharper and more real than she ever dared to believe. So, as the calendar turned and the bitter winds of winter set in, moving through the end of December and crossing over into January of 1542, Catherine was kept on lockdown at Sion. She spent Christmas Day under heavy surveillance, watching the guards instead of opening gifts. There was no grand banquet laid out to celebrate her royalty, and the halls were silent. No festive music, no laughter, just the hollow echo of her own impending doom. Even her connection to the divine was censored. If she attended worship, it was a bare-bones ritual with all the glory stripped away. Then New Year's Day rolled around, marking another turn of the sun, and miraculously she was still breathing air, as the gavel hadn't officially banged down to pronounce her sentence. Now in the context of that Tudor beast system, that silence could be misinterpreted as mercy, giving her a false sense of hope. Everyone knew King Henry was unstable and flip-flopped on decisions, so maybe his wrath would cool down. There was this thought that maybe the legislative body Parliament would intervene with a plea bargain, pushing for a simple annulment and exile instead of the death penalty. But outside those abbey walls, the net was getting tighter and the dragnet was widening as the authorities came for the whole bloodline. Members of the Howard family were being hauled in for interrogation. It was a total crackdown. Some were thrown into dungeons, while others were forced to take oaths, swearing to God they knew nothing of Catherine's past just to save their own skins. Look at how the mighty fall. Powerful relatives like the Duke of Norfolk moved lightning fast to cut ties separating their fate from hers, even though they were the ones who pushed her forward when it filled their pockets. But the moment the heat got turned up, they scrambled for the exits, retreating into the shadows and abandoning her entirely to the wolves. Now, one of the most devastating side stories in this saga belonged to Jane Boleyn, also known as Lady Rochford, a woman who had served in the inner circle of two different royal administrations. She was a survivor who had already walked away with her life after the catastrophic downfall of Anne Boleyn and her own husband George Boleyn. But judgment circles back around, and as the woman who carried messages and guarded the doors for Catherine and Culpeper, she was sucked right into this new whirlwind of destruction. When the authorities applied the pressure during interrogation, her psyche couldn't handle the weight of it, and her mind literally began to fracture and break. By the time we get to late 1541, reports describe a woman who had lost touch with reality, raving like a lunatic, incoherent, and unable to even comprehend the charges being levied against her. Now here is where the legal system hit a brick wall, because under English law at the time, you could not legally execute someone who was mentally insane, since the punishment was supposed to be a lesson for the public. If the person being killed has no clue why they are dying, the whole ritual loses its purpose and becomes pointless slaughter. But this rule was a stumbling block for the king because Henry wanted Lady Rochford punished. He blamed her personally for arranging the meetings that destroyed his reputation and manhood. So the solution the government cooked up exposes just how corrupt and ruthless these systems of power really are when they want to take you out. They literally went into the legislature and pushed through a special act of parliament changing the law to say that even if you are judged insane, you can still be executed if your crime is treason. Don't be fooled, everybody knew exactly who this law was written for. It was a weapon aimed squarely at Lady Rochford, rewriting the rules just to legally murder one woman. When the word of this legal maneuvering reached Catherine back at Sion, she watched the last walls of protection crumble before her eyes. She realized the grim truth: if they were willing to change the law to execute a mad widow, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to do whatever was necessary to take out a disgraced queen. Stuck in that abbey, Catherine tried to keep it together, maintaining some shadow of order in her life by turning to spiritual warfare and prayer. She got down on her knees and confessed her sins to the Creator the way she had been taught, begging for mercy for her soul, even if her physical body was condemned to die. There were moments where she tried to steady her trembling spirit with the thought that other queens in history had been spared the axe. But those hopeful thoughts were quickly smashed by the knowledge that Derham and Culpeper were already dead, and that a new law had been crafted just to kill Rochford. Her mind became a battlefield, swinging back and forth between a stubborn, flickering spark of hope and the heavy leaden certainty that her fate was already sealed. The servants who watched her reported that her demeanor was erratic. One minute she would speak calmly, asking practical questions about her living arrangements, and then, in the blink of an eye, she would completely collapse, dissolving into a puddle of hysterical tears. She was trapped in the unknown, not knowing if she should prepare for a lifetime of solitary confinement or a short walk to the scaffold, and no one in authority would give her a straight answer. They deliberately let her stew in that psychological torment while they finalized the paperwork, and the answer finally dropped on February 10th, 1542. The king's officials showed up at Sion Abbey once again, but this time there was no talk of asking questions or further investigations. They hit her with the news that she was being transported to the Tower of London, and anybody knew that the tower wasn't a place for long-term safekeeping. That fortress was the waiting room for death, the place where the crown sent prisoners when the king was ready to make a final bloody example. Desperate for a lifeline, Catherine pleaded with them, asking what this move meant for her and if there was any chance of a pardon. She wanted to know if the king's heart had softened, but the men who came to collect her offered absolutely no comfort to her trembling spirit. Some sources say they gave vague answers about it being in the king's hands, while others say they stood in stone-cold silence, but the destination spoke louder than words. Catherine knew exactly what the Tower of London represented and the dark reputation it held. She knew her own cousin Anne Boleyn had passed through those ominous gates and never walked out alive. And now she was being told she would travel the same path by barge down the Thames. Armed guards would be her escort, and the arrangements were set in stone. In that moment, every tiny shred of hope she had clung to collided with a brutal fact. You don't send prisoners to the tower without a dark reason, and the road ahead was narrowing down to a single fatal outcome. Stay tuned, because in the next part, we are going to walk with her step by step as she leaves the walls of Sion. We are looking at a scene heavy with spiritual significance as the barge passes beneath the bridge where the severed heads of Derham and Culpeper are still rotting away, decaying in the open air as a warning to the masses before entering the tower through the very same watergate that had swallowed Anne Boleyn whole years earlier. We are going to break down exactly how she spent those final critical hours, how she got her spirit ready to meet her maker. Because there is a serious lesson in this for all of us watching today. And we need to discuss a specific request she made, something so intense that it still disturbs people. Centuries later, she actually asked for the execution block ahead of time so she could practice laying her head down before the real judgment moment arrived. When the day finally came for Catherine to depart Sion Abbey, the powers that be didn't even try to hide the brutal reality of what was going down. They told her to get ready right then and there. Her few remaining servants helped her get dressed, but listen, there was no crown, no shining jewelry, and definitely no royal parade for this final trip. She was marched straight to a barge waiting on the dark waters of the Thames River, sealing her fate in the natural world. You had government agents climbing on board, right next to her soldiers locking into position. And as they pushed off the shore, turning toward London, the atmosphere shifted to pure dread. Everybody on that boat knew the deal. They understood exactly what it meant to be transported to the Tower of London under heavy armed guard in this wicked system. That river was the standard highway for high-ranking prisoners to be disposed of. Catherine sat in a seat of honor. But let's be real, it was the kind of honor reserved for a walking dead woman who would never taste freedom again. As that barge drifted down the current, creeping closer to the heart of the city, they approached the infamous London Bridge. She knew exactly what was waiting for her up above that roadway, two severed heads blackened and decaying from the harsh winter exposure mounted on spikes like trophies of a corrupt kingdom. It was Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper. Even if she refused to lift her eyes and look at them directly, her spirit felt the weight of their presence right there in the atmosphere. The message didn't need any subtitles, family. The men who were connected to her had been slaughtered as traitors, and the writing was clearly on the wall. She was walking down that same road of destruction, and the barge just kept moving past the bridge, heading straight for the belly of the beast, the tower. Then the fortress itself loomed up on the riverbank, a massive monument to tyranny and stone-cold judgment. We are talking solid stone massive walls and towers designed to crush any hope of escape. The boat swung around toward the water entrance at the base of the outer wall. Future generations would label this traitor's gate, but for Catherine in that moment, it was simply the doorway used for high-value prisoners the state wanted to erase. The barge slipped silently beneath that stone archway. The passage was tight, narrow, and when the boat finally stopped, those cold stone stairs led upward right into the heart of the tower. The guards hauled her out, and she had to climb up into the very same place where Anne Boleyn had walked before her own state-sanctioned execution. Once inside, notice this. Catherine wasn't thrown into a dark dungeon hole, but was taken to chambers actually prepared for her arrival, because remember, she was still blood royalty. She had held the title of Queen. Her rooms were located in the royal section of the tower, not down in the filth of the worst cells where the commoners rotted. She had a bed, she had a small staff of attendants, but make no mistake, every single door was locked from the outside. She was a bird in a gilded cage, unable to move without permission from the hierarchy. The spiritual atmosphere of that tower was thick with the stories of death and betrayal. Nobody needed to explain to her what usually happens to the people the king sends to this place. From the jump, Catherine understood that her clock was ticking down. Back at Sion, the days were long and empty, with no clear end in sight, just waiting in limbo. But here in the tower, everything accelerated. She got the word that Parliament, the lawmakers and elites of the day were handling her case personally. Instead of getting a fair trial where she could speak, they were drafting a special bill to condemn her and rewrite the laws to make any future marriage for King Henry free and lawful, covering their own tracks. They treated her guilt like it was already a done deal. All that was left was pushing the paperwork through to make the murder legal in the eyes of the public. Now, the historical sources that describe her final days all agree on one striking detail that we need to pay attention to right now. Catherine didn't spend her last hours screaming or fighting against the inevitable. She went into prayer. She spoke with her spiritual advisor. She accepted the reality that death was knocking at the door. Then, she made a request that still disturbs people today because of the level of composure and awareness it took. She actually asked for the execution block to be brought directly to her private chamber. She wanted to practice exactly how to position her head so she wouldn't shake or falter when the world was watching. Even for the hardened officials in charge, this was strange, but they agreed to it. They carried that wooden block of death right into her room. Catherine knelt down beside it and rehearsed the very movement she would soon have to perform before the eyes of the witnesses and the executioner. She learned exactly where to place her hands. She figured out how to lower her neck just right. She repeated this grim rehearsal until she was certain she could execute it without a single moment of hesitation. She wanted to leave this world with control, maintaining the dignity she had tried to hold on to as a queen even while the system tore her down. In a situation where the enemy had stripped almost everything away from her, this was the one thing she could still govern for herself. Outside her chamber walls, the machine of death kept moving forward. The bill against her was passed into law by the powers that be. She was legally condemned as a traitor labeled vicious and carnal for her life before marriage and accused of treason for her dealings with Culpeper and Derham afterward. There was absolutely zero opportunity for her to stand up and defend herself against these accusations in a court of law. No lawyer stood up to speak for her. The decision flowed down from the king through his corrupt council and parliament and straight back to the Tower like a decree from Babylon. And let's not forget Lady Rochford Jane Boleyn, who was also being prepped for the slaughter right alongside her. They even changed the law to permit the execution of insane persons just to remove the barrier protecting her. The officials declared her fit enough to face the axe. She and Catherine were scheduled to die on the same day. Two women who served the royal household now marked as examples of what happens when a king believes his pride has been wounded. The night before the execution, reports say, Catherine slept very little if she closed her eyes at all, wrestling with the weight of what was coming. She knew the plan for the morning. She knew she would be led out to a scaffold on Tower Green to face the end of her journey. You have to visualize the scene to understand the gravity of the ritual. A specific small crowd of the elite had gathered high-ranking witnesses standing by like vultures while the state-appointed executioner stood waiting with his axe, the instrument of judgment. The system demanded she speak. In that dark era, just as we see with public apologies in 2026, condemned prisoners were expected to participate in their own humiliation by delivering a final address. It was all part of the blood ritual. These final words were designed to validate the authority of the state. She was supposed to publicly admit her guilt, heap praise upon the wicked king, and beg the crowd for their prayers. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, Catherine stripped away the royal finery and dressed in plain, humble clothing suitable for the sacrifice. She spent her final moments in spiritual warfare praying to the Most High. She fought to steady her spirit against the rising tide of fear. When the guards, the enforcers of the crown, arrived, she walked with them into the biting cold of the winter air, stepping out of the prison and into history. Her steps carried her up onto the wooden platform, the altar of death. The eyes of the world were upon her, officials, churchmen, soldiers, all watching the spectacle. She had rehearsed this very moment in her chamber, preparing her soul for the end. Now the moment of reckoning had arrived. She opened her mouth to speak to those present, knowing this was her last testimony on this earth. While different witnesses recorded the details with slight variations, the core of their accounts reveals a spiritual truth. She did not attack the king, she did not challenge the beast system or his authority. Instead, she confessed that she had offended both God and the king, admitting that under the law of the land, she deserved to die for her transgressions. She asked the listeners to pray for the king's long life and for mercy on her own soul. But watch closely at what she did not say. She made a significant move by refusing to openly admit to the sin of adultery. She accepted the sentence of death, yet she did not clearly state or confirm the narrative that she had slept with Culpeper after her marriage vows were exchanged. Even at the bitter end, she held back that specific confession, refusing to give them total satisfaction. When her speech was concluded, Catherine turned toward the block. She knelt down in submission. This was the precise movement she had repeated over and over again, with the practice block drilling the muscle memory of her own death. She positioned herself with agonizing precision so the executioner could perform his dark work quickly. She stretched out her arms, signaling readiness, and placed her neck upon the wood. There were no reports of hysteria, no crying out, no attempting to flee the judgment. The executioner raised his axe high and brought it down with the full weight of the state behind it. With one single brutal stroke, it was finished. Her severed head and her body were immediately taken to the chapel within the tower St. Peter ad Vincula. There, she was unceremoniously buried in the floor near other victims of Henry's wrath, including Anne Boleyn. There was no monument raised, no honor given to her memory at that time. No grand marker announced that a former queen lay rotting there. Her grave was simply part of a pattern of quiet, erased burials for those condemned and crushed by the crown. Lady Rochford followed her to the same scaffold moments later. She too died by beheading, another sacrifice to the king's ego and the law's cruelty. The draconian law written specifically to permit her execution had served its demonic purpose effectively. Two women, one barely out of her teenage years and the other older, both tied to Henry's toxic marriages, were wiped from the earth within the same morning. King Henry VIII did not even come to the Tower. He refused to watch Catherine die. He was elsewhere continuing his life and his rule without a shred of remorse. There is no record of him ever speaking meaningfully about her after the slaughter. Only months later, the spirit of lust drove him to pursue yet another marriage, continuing the cycle. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, would eventually outlive him. Henry died years later in the comfort of his own bed, not in disgrace or prison, remaining a king whose brutal treatment of his wives was rarely challenged to his face. Looking back through the lens of history, it is tempting to focus solely on the dramatic moment the axe fell. But the most agonizing part of Catherine's story isn't the death itself. It is the psychological torture and events that transpired before the blade ever descended. She was forced to watch as everyone connected to her was dragged into the danger zone. Francis Dereham was tortured and killed in the most brutal, barbaric manner the law allowed. Thomas Culpeper was executed not just for actions, but for feelings and intentions tied to her thought crimes, punished by death. Jane Boleyn lost her sanity under the pressure of questioning and then lost her life under a law written specifically to eliminate the legal protection of madness. Servants from her household were interrogated, imprisoned, or completely destroyed by the system. Her own family, the powerful Howards, abandoned her to save their own skins. Catherine herself endured weeks of crushing uncertainty, a psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit. First, she was trapped at Hampton Court, locked in her chambers, forced to listen to the king oscillating between weeping and raging on the other side of the walls. Then she was moved to Sion Abbey, cut off from all real information, knowing only that heads were being mounted on spikes and new laws were being passed to ensure her destruction. Every single day she woke up alive, she had to confront the terrifying question of her fate. Would this be the day they came to say she was forgiven? Or would this be the day they came to drag her to the Tower for execution? That slow, grinding terror marked her soul more deeply than the final few seconds on the scaffold ever could. To understand the full horror of this situation, you must remember how young she was and how her earlier life had shaped her. As a child and young teenager, she lived in a household with almost no effective protection or oversight. The corrupt system of that day did not treat that as abuse. Instead, it treated it as evidence of her own sin and corruption. As a teenager, she fell into a relationship with Francis Dereham in a chaotic environment where no responsible adult intervened to explain the consequences or protect her innocence. Those formative years created memories and actions that investigators would later weaponize against her to secure a death sentence. When she married Henry, the expectation was that she be flawless. The king needed a pure bride, and the court demanded a queen who never made mistakes. But nothing in her broken past had prepared her to navigate that role with the cold calculation required to survive the nest of vipers. She was emotional-spirited and young. She missed the familiar faces from her earlier life and drew them dangerously close, not realizing the trap she was setting. She responded to kindness and romantic attention from Thomas Culpeper when her aging tyrannical husband offered her nothing. We are talking about an ailing husband, a man physically rotting away who could no longer offer the warmth or protection a wife needs. Now, do not get it twisted, I'm not claiming she was walking in total innocence. But what this situation reveals is just how impossible and crushing the expectations of that wicked system really were. You have to look at the power structure here. Henry VIII sat on his throne like a god, discarding wives, hurling accusations, and signing death warrants without a second thought. The man was never in any genuine danger from the law because he was the law, a tyrant operating with total immunity, while the innocent paid the price. But understand this. Catherine was not just facing the executioner's block for the sins she committed after she put on that wedding ring. It went much deeper than that. They were condemning her for the trauma, the grooming, and the manipulation she suffered years ago when she was just a child. The establishment treated her like a piece of damaged property that failed to meet their corrupt standards of perfection. And once the powers that be decided her fate, the demonic machinery of the state started grinding forward. And let me tell you, that machine does not stop for anyone. There is one specific chilling moment from her story that visitors to Hampton Court still talk about to this day. This went down before they shipped her off to Sion, before she was thrown into the tower. In those dark days, right after they locked her down in the palace, when the reality of the accusation truly hit her spirit, Catherine attempted one last desperate act of survival. She literally broke loose from her captors, tearing away from the guards and sprinting through that long, shadowing gallery that connected her prison chambers to the king's sanctuary. She was screaming for Henry at the top of her lungs. She was calling out, begging for just one chance to speak with him face to face. She truly believed that if she could just reach him in the flesh, throw herself at his feet and plead her case, he might find some mercy in his heart. But friends, she never got that chance. The guards intercepted her right before she could reach his door. They grabbed her violently and dragged her back into the darkness while she was still crying out for her life. And Henry, he either did not hear her screams, or worse, he heard every single one and chose not to respond. She was taken away and she never laid eyes on him again. That specific hallway in the palace has earned a name throughout history that fits the tragedy perfectly: the Haunted Gallery. For centuries, people have claimed to hear the echoes of a woman's screams in that place. Now, that might remain legend rather than proven fact, but what the historical sources actually record is this. A terrified young queen ran down that cold corridor, calling out for her husband to save her, but he remained completely out of reach, a silence that sealed her doom. When you really piece this puzzle together, the picture you get is not just of a fallen queen who broke the rules and paid the price. That is the lie they want you to believe. It is the picture of a teenager pulled from a damaged and abusive upbringing right into the center of power, only to be crushed by a system designed to protect the elite at any cost. Her death may have been swift in the end, but the months leading up to it, they were long, bewildering, and filled with a level of suffering and psychological torment she had absolutely no control over. If you have stuck with me until this point in the video, I want to say thank you for seeking the truth. To keep getting real history told in a raw, honest, and uncompromising way, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications right now. Go ahead and give this video a like so we can reach more people with this message, and share it with someone who still thinks these Tudor stories are just about romance and fancy costumes. It is time to wake them up and let them see what really happened to Catherine Howard.